Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Hamilton Reads 2021 panel on climate fiction. This is the second of 4 online conversations around the themes in Blaise Island. Information about the next 2 events will be posted in the chat. Please use the same chat box to ask questions to the authors. Today, we are joined by climate fiction authors Catherine Bush, David Huebert, and Shaena Lambert, moderated by Jason Allen. Kyle McClare said of Blaise Island, riveting and morally complex, Blaise Island is a beautiful, kaleidoscopic work that offers a resounding reply to the question of how literature might wrestle with the deepest threat facing the planet, anthropogenic climate change. Each author here today writes about climate change and environmentalism with the same conviction. My name is Nancy, and I'm tremendously pleased to host this conversation about words and the world. I will take a moment to acknowledge that the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish-with-One-Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792, between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. I'm pleased to welcome our authors and encourage you to find their publications at local independent bookstores like Epic Books at their Locke and Sherman Avenue locations, King West Books in Westdale, The City and the City on Ottawa Street, and all retailers that support books and literacy. Catherine Bush is the author of 5 novels, including Blaise Island, 2020, a Globe and Mail Best Book, and The Rules of Engagement, 2000, a national bestseller and New York Times notable book. Her books have been shortlisted for the Trillium and City of Toronto Book Awards. She is the coordinator of the University of Guelph Creative Writing MFA, located in Toronto. Her work has appeared recently in Terrain, Brick, Emergence, the Dalhousie Review, the New York Times, and other publications. Her essay, Writing the Real about writing climate fiction, is out in Best Canadian Essays 2021. David Huebert, he, him, is a settler, writer, and educator from Chibuktuk, Halifax. A self-styled dirty nature writer, David's work explores human entanglements with non-human life. David's fiction debut, Peninsula Sinking, won a Dartmouth Book Award and was runner-up for the Danuta Gleed Literary Award. His writing has won the CBC Prize and was a finalist for the 2020 Journey Prize. His latest book of fiction is Chemical Valley from Biblioasis 2021. David teaches literature and creative writing at the University of New Brunswick. Shayna Lambert is the author of 4 works of fiction, Petra, Oh My Darling, Radiance, and The Falling Woman. Her work has been published to critical acclaim in Canada, the UK, and Germany, and has been nominated for the Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, the Ethel Wilson Award, the Evergreen Award, the Danuta Gleed Award, and the Frank O'Connor Award for the short story. Her stories have been anthologized 4 times in Best Canadian Stories and published in many magazines, including The Walrus, Plowshares, and Zoetrope All Story. Her most recent novel, Petra, was inspired by a German activist and Green Party founder, Petra Kelly, who transformed environmental politics, only to find herself caught up in a triangle of love, jealousy, and murder. Stephen Milder in the Boston Review wrote, "As a work of historical fiction, Petra brings Kelly herself and the radical green utopias she advocated to the fore in a way that no biography or work of scholarship yet has." Petra won the 2021 Ethel Wilson Award for Best Work of Fiction in BC and the Yukon, and was the CBC Best Book of the Year. Jason Allen is the host of the Environmental Urbanist radio show and podcast on 933 CFMU. He also writes the Environmental Urbanist newsletter, and his essays about climate change and city politics appear regularly in the Hamilton Spectator. Jason is one of the founders of Woodcraft Canada, an organization dedicated to helping young people explore the outdoors. He lives in Kirkendall, Hamilton, with his wife, 2 sons, 2 cats, and an increasingly unruly vegetable garden. I'll pass things over to Jason, who will begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who's here today. We can't see you, but we know you can see us, and we're grateful for you being here. I'm going to start this event like every good literary event should start, with hearing from the author's works themselves. So in the same order you introduced, I'm going to ask each author to read just a minute or two out of their relevant book, and we're going to start with Catherine.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. And it's such a pleasure to be here this afternoon and in such good company with all of you, Shaena, David, and Jason. So I'm going to read from my novel, Blaise Island, the Hamilton Reads pick this year. And just to set it up, in Blaise Island, a climate scientist set upon by climate change deniers abandons his academic life and flees to a remote island with his young daughter, teaches her to be self-reliant amid this isolation. And then in the present of the novel, in tandem with a huge hurricane that sweeps past the island, strangers begin to arrive and disrupt Miranda's life. But the very short section I'm going to read is a flashback. And one of the things I wanted to do in the novel was bring ice to the fore, and I'll probably talk about that a bit more. I mean, ice is so essential for planetary life and our survival on a planetary scale. And I think, you know, here in our somewhat southern cities, it's possible for us to forget how entwined our lives are with ice. Far at their backs, icebergs floated slowly past out on the Labrador Current, shimmering in a heat haze at the horizon. When they came at last around the volcanic mound of Blaise Head, rising like a giant skull out of the water, there were the masses of icebergs that Caleb had promised and that Miranda's father had mentioned at supper the evening before. Icebergs filling the entire breadth of the bay, stretching northward as far as the eye could see, so many it was impossible to count. Large ones tall as houses, small ones like pale creatures. The blue of the sky had turned dull white under a haze of cirrus cloud, and still the icebergs glistened, every color in the spectrum of blue and green, cobalt, turquoise, aquamarine, emerald. From one angle, they looked like one thing, from another, something else. As the icebergs turned, they revealed arches, hollows, ponds, fissures. It was hard to know how to describe them other than to compare them to other things. This one's a castle. No, a dragon. There were no words. Some swayed, unbalanced by their melting. Drafts of cold air billowed from them. For long moments, the two of them sat in the boat, motor idling, and awed into silence, they did no more than stare. The icebergs were as old as the ice her father had once studied. Could some of them actually be the same ice? Layers of thousands of years, their own lives nothing but a film on top. Yet the icebergs had come here to dissolve. How little time it took for eternities to vanish. Gone. The thought sank into Miranda. Could you say an iceberg was dying? They'd come here to die? Her father might say so, or Anaturi, or Agnes Watson. Here they were, witnessing that death. The death of the world. Their world? Them? This was what her father feared. The death of the world as they knew it. The icebergs floated mutely in the heat. Their presence seemed to speak and pose a question. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. That was lovely. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Definitely looking forward to unpacking some of the themes, not only from your book, even from that passage later on. Thank you. Next up, I would love to hear from David from a passage from his book.
Great. Yeah, so it's truly a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to read from a story called Chemical Valley, which is the title story of this book. I would like to get a chance to set up the story more, but I'll just say it's about a worker at a petrochemical refinery in Sarnia, Ontario. I'm telling Eileen how I want to be buried, namely inside a tree. We're sitting in bed eating Thai from the mall and listening to the 6 p.m. construction outside our window. The city tearing up the whole street along with tree roots and a rusted tangle of lead pipes. And I'm telling Eileen it's called a biodegradable burial pod. Mouthful of cashew curry, and I'm saying what they do is put your remains in this egg-looking thing like the xenomorph's cocoon from Alien Resurrection, but it's made of biodegradable plastic. I'm telling Eileen it's called a capsula mundi, and what they do is hitch the remains to a semi-mature tree and plant the whole package. Stuff you down in fetal position and let you gradually decay until you become nitrogen, seep into soil. Eileen asks where I got the idea about the burial pod, and I tell her Facebook or maybe an email newsletter. You click on that shit? Why are you even thinking about this now? You just turned 34. I don't tell her about the basement, about Mum. I don't tell her about the pigeons strewn out on the concrete and then going supernova in the incinerator. I don't mention how it gets me thinking about flesh, about bodies, about waste. Eileen picks a bamboo shoot from her molars. Since when are you into trees? She says it's smug. She says it like Miss University Sciences, and nobody else is allowed to like trees. I don't tell her how we're all compost. And yes, I read that on a Facebook link. I also did not tell her about the article's tagline, "Your carbon footprint doesn't end in the grave." Reaching for the pad thai, I tell her about the balance, how it's only natural, how the human body is rich in nitrogen, how when you use a coffin, there's a lot of waste because the body just rots on its own when it could be giving nutrients to the system, not to mention all the metals and treated woods. I tell her how the idea is to phase out traditional graveyards entirely, replace them with grave forests. Eileen says, gazing out the window, the sky a caramelized rose. Is this a guilt thing from working at the plants? I tell her no, maybe, I don't know. An excavator hisses its load into the earth. So I'm just gonna end there. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful, thank you, and I love that story so much. So, looking forward to hearing more about it. And of course, Shayna, let's hear from your passage from Petra.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you to the Hamilton Public Library, and it's such an honor to be here with Catherine and Dave and you, Jason, and also thanks to Nancy McPhee and Kate Morrison for organizing this. It's yeah, it's such an honor to be connected to Blaise Island as the one book that Hamilton's reading, and to play a part in this. So the piece I'm reading is from my book Petra, which is here. It takes place in the 80s, and it's really about a love affair between a general who leaves NATO and becomes involved in the Green Party, and his passion for Petra Kelly, who was the founder of the Green Party of Germany and a very charismatic and fascinating, volatile, egotistical, narcissistic, beautiful, generous woman. She's a larger than life character. And this little section I'm actually reading, it's narrated by a third man, Manfred Schwartz, and I'm reading a little section that deals with how hard it is to craft a program to save the world. And this is what he's trying to do in his farmhouse in just outside of Bonn. Now I'm back at the farmhouse. Manfred Schwartz, 32 years old, a man in his prime, and I've got a beer in my hand and a pile of marked up pages on the kitchen table in front of me to craft our new federal program for the Green Party of West Germany. It surprises me to think that, yes, there I was in my youth, and I spent every second working, planning, strategizing. Never mind, This was my passion. It was our passion. This was the 80s, and I wasn't holed up in a punk bar, bashing my head against the wall to Die Toten Hosen or the Sex Pistols, or just fucking around as one believes one ought to have done looking back. Youth is wasted on the young, of course, etc., etc. Anyway, I took a sip of my beer and I said, Los Gates, let's go. It's like a potion. You've got to get the mix of ingredients right, or the thing would explode. First, a dash of feminism to satisfy Freya Fertig and her powerful group, Frauen für den Frieden, because women must be at the heart. Manfred, of course, I'm hearing her say this in my ear. But wait, the non-violent pacifists, a cranky group if you've ever seen one, wanted civil disobedience to be at the heart. They're talking Gandhi, Satyagraha. Many of the influential citizens' initiatives wanted the fight against nuclear power to be at the heart. So now we've got 4 minds and we've got 4 opinions. Or do we have 4,000 minds, 4,000 opinions? Then I had to add a little dash of anarchism for the sponties, spontaneous leftist politicos, they're basement lovers, ex-squatters of Frankfurt and Berlin, like myself. But hold off now, not too much, or the mix could combust, causing infighting and narcissistic posturing. And I had to keep the Hamburg Red Greens happy, militant anti-capitalists. They joined the Green Party because they saw it as the path to power. They could smell power the way worms smell rain. They often met in cadres, establishing their line and then voting as a group. Their politics was dogmatically left-wing Marxist stuff. Many supported the Eastern Bloc, though they were way too savvy to make this public. Then there were the farmers, the visionaries, the conservatives, ecologists. Fucking Jesus, I said. This is difficult. I'd have to start again. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. It's also one of my favorite passages from your book. As a longtime community organizer, that passage resonated with me so much of trying to balance all those competing interests. So I felt like I was in Manfred's shoes, although we'll talk later about how much I loved some of your other characters. Thank you, everybody, for your readings. Those are wonderful sort of snippets of your book, and I think they really let readers and listeners hear the character of your book and the essence of your writing. So just lovely portions. Thank you. I'm going to dig into some questions here and ask a few questions that really I think apply in different ways to all of your books. So I think your answers will all be quite different, but I think broadly speaking, we're talking about climate fiction today. We're talking about writing about climate and climate change, and as different from nature writing, which is a very different thing, right? I know you, David, I believe you described yourself as a dirty nature writer, which was the phrase you used. But yeah, but nature writing to me is very much a sort of a literary nonfiction kind of genre where people write about essays and memoirs about their interactions with nature. But climate fiction is, I mean, Catherine may correct me on this, but it's a fairly new thing. Like it hasn't been around very long, and it's only been recently that the literary world has become aware of this crisis we're in and how to translate that into fiction. So my question for all three of you would be, it felt like in many ways either the climate or the environment or climate change was a character in your book. And I know in any sort of good fiction book, you have to have a good grounding in its sense of place, but it felt more than that for you folks. I know, David, I felt like I could drive anywhere in Sarnia amongst the gas plants and the windmills and feel familiar. And Shayna, in your book, very much the climate was this overarching motivation for everything they were doing, although their own motivations were very, very, very complex along the way, but there was this overarching thing they did. And of course, Catherine, it was the environment is almost a person, whether it's the storms, whether it's the polar ice, whether it's these things that motivate everyone. So starting with you, Catherine, talk to me about the role that the climate played as almost a character in your books.
Thanks for that great question, Jason. And just, to backtrack, you were talking about, climate fiction being a fairly recent thing. And I would just, say it's certainly something I've been thinking about for a long time. And I know that the writer Amitav Ghosh kind of made this call out, especially to writers of literary fiction some years ago. I mean, acknowledging this absence, particularly in the world of literary fiction. But I will just say that novels take some years to write for many of us, for most of us, certainly for me. And so, I've been working on Blaise Island since 2012 and thinking about it before that. And it's, complicated to know how to respond. And I think I was thinking about the term climate fiction, and in a way, I like to use the term at the moment climate responsive fiction, because I feel, that it's, climate is so vague, but I do want to respond in some way to the climate crisis. I feel that it's a form of realism that we all need to as fiction writers now somehow, but there are a multitude of ways of doing it. And in Blaise Island, the story focuses on a climate scientist and his daughter and his particular journey as he's trying to figure out what to do to protect his daughter, both from climate deniers and the increasingly wild and unpredictable weather. And in a sense, climate is an abstract. Weather is not. And so, weather and wind are the presences. And what I really wanted to bring into the novel, and I mean, one of the things I ethically feel right now is I do want to decenter the human. I don't want to just tell a human story. I want to tell a more than human story as well, and bring to life a world that's full of animals and land and wind and ice and sky. And so there's an ethics to that, but I also really want a reader to experience that. And so, to amplify all those other elements in the story. So yes, I mean, the wind is a presence, the wind has a voice, the wind is a body that Miranda has to, battle with or struggle with in a deeply physical way. And the ice too, there's these encounters with ice, and there's a moment when the characters actually swallow ice and, feel these ancient bubbles of air that, are entering their bodies. So I want that deeply physical experience in the encounters with the world. So that is climate, but I want it, specific in the form of, another character, Caleb, kind of descends into animals at certain moments of trauma and loses a sense of his own body. Mila and Alan, the climate scientist, walks into the landscape until he loses a sense of self. So all those things just feel important experientially, and they're what I want to gift to a reader, so they might be transformed through, the fictional experience of living through these characters' transformations.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Absolutely. And there was having spent some time in Newfoundland, although not on Fogo Island, there was a really vivid sense of sort of being there when I was reading your book. It was lovely. And similarly with you, David, there was this sense of I spent a bunch of time in Norfolk County and sort of down that way, but in your stories, it's almost like the climate was angry. It was angry about what we'd done to it in so many ways. Talk to me about the role of that of your character, the climate.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love this question, first of all, so thank you. Yeah, I'm very interested in this claim about the angry climate. I would say the climate is agitated. Yeah, and I'm a bit skeptical of revenge of nature narratives in general. I think, we can sensationalize and oversimplify a lot when we rely on that sort of discourse. I'm interested, but yeah, I find that fascinating. A couple of people have also thought of my story collection as being a near future setting, even though it was not intended as a near future setting. So that's an interesting, there's a sort of dystopian present, right, in which we're living that I think my book tries to animate or foreground. I also think, just in relationship to what sort of Catherine is saying, it's interesting to think, and this question of this emergent genre of climate fiction, and I'm sure we all situate ourselves differently in that emergent genre. Certainly, tradition like Cli-Fi, right, was originally a sort of science fiction dystopian look, right? Where now, as Catherine's indicating, there's a lot more sort of realist or so-called literary fiction invested in climate crisis. Another interesting thing to think about is how old this tradition is as well, because as Catherine, I'm sure, would not disagree with, Catherine's book very deeply engages with the Tempest, right? So we can see that, one of the things all fiction is environmental to some extent, right? We ask writers to create environments. So this we can sort of turn this question on its head, and we can look at the deep and fundamental engagement that human story has always had with non-human life, actually, right? You can look at something like The Tempest, you can look at something like Moby Dick, you can look at all the very first stories ever told, the very first sort of human strivings towards art. Those are so deeply bound by and related to the ecological world. I think we're all, I think story has been ecological all along, in other words, is a really important thing for me to think about. In my own work, though, coming back to this question about character, fascinating, important frame. Environment totally is a character, functions very differently in all these different stories, I think, but is always a bit agitated. I'm thinking particularly about petroleum. Trying to work through the aesthetics of petroleum in a literary way was something I was really thinking a lot about and struggling against a lot when I was sort of conceiving and working with this book. It ended up being surprisingly gothic, which is not a genre that I gravitate to. Well, it's a genre I'm very interested in reading and I've read a lot of, but it's not one that I would have guessed I would be writing in. But the material seemed to want to. Oil is an underworld, right? Oil is an underworld substance. So I found myself always reaching down when I was trying to access this sort of questions around oil. And so in the title story, Chemical Valley, things start bubbling up from the basement, right? And sort of you get a little bit of a hint of that in the reading that I read. But yeah, there's a very downward look, and there's a way in which oil took on a life of its own and tried to animate that story as this sort of downward facing presence. So that's all I'll say about that question. Thank you for the lovely question.
Thank you. I guess having grown up in Alberta, I always equate the oil industry with anger. So maybe that was my connection there. It's a very intense, often anger-filled field. Shayna, in Petra, the climate is this presence behind everything all your characters are doing, and like I say, their motivations get very, very complex, and love and revenge and ego and all these things. But in the back through all of this, the climate is this motivating factor, and also the description of Europe in the 80s was so real. Just even that passage you read about, messing around in punk bars, right? That was the description of life sort of in Germany in the 80s, and understanding that in a story set in sort of a very built up Europe, the environment's going to be a very different place. But it still felt it played such an important role in your book. Talk to me a bit about how you sort of worked that out.
Okay, I mean, these questions are so huge, and also my fellow writers' answers were so interesting. I sort of want to talk really fast so I can talk about it all. I guess what I'd say in terms of Petra, climate was only like in the, my book starts in 83, and by 90, when the Greens have an election, it's just a newly unified Germany. Every political question is about how that unification is going to take place. And the Greens, in a great act of either prescience or self-destruction, decide they're going to run their campaign on global warming. And that comes near the end of my book. And I have to say, I get shivers when I think about that, because that just was real. And of course, they went down in flames. And I think that what happens in my book, I mean, as Catherine was saying, as you write, it takes a long time. You don't really know what you're writing about. And it's only towards the end that I realized how much this book that takes place in the 80s and the very early 90s, and then has a kind of fast forward at the end up into the present, was like an arrow pointing from our present crisis back into the past, and how this incredibly visionary group of people were handling the questions that now are destroying or could destroy us. So climate kind of plays that role. It plays a role as something kind of lurking in the background, a little bit unsaid, until the very end, when in a few pages, I hope I bring everyone up to speed. On Catherine's thing, when she was talking about the icebergs and reading about the icebergs, and I really felt when I read Blaise Island that there was so much hope, because even though things were so grim, it was so beautifully described. You know, and I felt that same thing, David, when you were just talking about the oil and the role of oil in this short story. And I find that very interesting, that when writers, fiction writers, explore something deeply, this beauty comes out. It's not a kind of grim dystopia, like page after page of agony as you read through what's going to happen. I think in the hands of thoughtful fiction writers, you often end up with something that surprisingly enlivens you. And I certainly felt that when I read The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh's book, which was so extraordinary, talking about the role of the uncanny in climate change, how nature has becoming so large that we can no longer ignore it, and its uncanny nature. So we have lived in a world where, you know, starting with Jane Austen, we kind of, you know, nature was really kept off to the side. There's these green lawns, and, you know, meanwhile human action is at the forefront. But as time goes on, we can't ignore the forces of nature, and I think that's terrifying, but also enlivening for us as writers to be in the midst of that world, and as Amitav Ghosh talks about, in the midst of the uncanny making itself present through acts that we have to face.
So true. So true. And it's the enormity of those acts that I want to sort of talk about next. It was a great segue. Thank you. This will be $5 later. In all great answers, and thank you for that insight. And that question went places I did not expect it to go, and I'm really grateful for that, because I thought it was really good responses. But talking about the enormity of those acts that you referred to, Shayna, in all three of your books, and I ask you this first, David, but in all three of your books, your characters all face consequences. And because we're talking about climate and literally saving the earth in some ways, those consequences seem enormous compared to what you might find in sort of non-climate fiction books. Those consequences are, I mean, Catherine, I'm thinking literally, if Alan screws this up, the world is done, right? it's that big a consequence. And same with Shayna, with Petra. The consequence she's trying to do is try to haul Europe out of this nuclear age and into this era of environment and climate. And David, some of your characters make these bizarre choices, and the consequences for them, some of them are huge. And talk to me about the role that consequences play in your book, and how that sort of plays out for you as an author, and how you sort of craft that into something that makes sense. David?
Yeah, thank you. This is another lovely question. It's one I haven't thought that much about, the relationship between like consequences as a craft move that comes sort of, you know, maybe second nature to me as a fiction writer, and consequences as an environmental phenomenon. But that's definitely at play here. I'm thinking about the third story in my book, which is called Swamp Things, which is about a young woman who gets entangled with in a bad romantic relationship with a teacher. And there's a lot of consequences at play in that situation. Meanwhile, the character, so I guess what I'm doing in a lot of these stories is doing a double, you have to have a consequences happening at the basic narrative level, i.e. in the old Vonnegut school of like, what I'm going to do is create characters and then throw a bunch of strife at them and see how they respond to that. Sometimes that's tied into ecological catastrophes in my stories, and sometimes it isn't. So the example I gave, it's not really, but at the same time, this character is very debilitated by what's popularly called eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. And so thinking through the broader, what's really interesting about this crisis, I think, is the way that consequences become a shared obligation or a shared responsibility, the way we feel new debts and new responsibilities arising, new obligations. We feel bad for children and children want us to feel bad for them. And they've made that very clear. Children are angry, right? In terms of what you're saying earlier about anger and oil. And so a lot of these, I guess the question is a question about consequences, and I don't see any easy answers. So I think that's one of the reasons, as Shayna was sort of indicating, why fiction is uniquely equipped to tackle many of these questions, which are actually fundamentally emotional questions, right? We know what right and wrong is here, most of us, pretty clearly, right? And yet that doesn't always help us work through how we feel. So pass it along.
That's also a great segue into. It's also a great segue into what I wanted to ask Shayna. My favorite character in your book is Emil. I love Emil. He resonated with me a lot. Not only, I mean, I spent a lot of time writing and talking, thinking about the changing nature of masculinity, and what it means to be a man in the climate era, and what it means to be a man in an era driven by greater equality. And I think, in my mind, Emil was at the beginning of sort of that whole thing, and he makes this enormously dramatic move to do the right thing. And I can't remember the German word that he uses to describe doing the right thing. But then over the course of the rest of the book, it just comes unraveled for him. And so was that consequent? Was that deliberately sort of a play on consequences with him, or how are you setting up the whole consequence of actions thing in your book? Because Petra faces a lot of them too.
Yeah, I mean, Emil is the general who gets involved with Petra, Emil Gerhardt, and the concept that you were talking about was innere Führung, and it's like inner leadership. And this is an idea that the new German army is really being taught, that they have to listen to their conscience, that they can't become rote followers of instruction as they were during the Nazi era. Or what happens? What happens is people commit things that are against their very hearts, against their souls, because they're told to. So he's trying to take that a step further when he gets involved with the Greens. And I'm always trying to balance his need to do these things for himself out of a kind of really good motive, and his self-serving nature. So he falls in love with Petra while she's incredibly sexy, and he leaves his wife. But on the other hand, he's trying to renew himself. He's trying to find what it means to be a new man in a new Germany, and I think he thinks the Green Party could lead him there. So the stakes are high for him, and I think how this plays into this question on the panel about climate fiction, I would say, is that he and Petra and Manfred and the people who are forming the Green Party, the stakes are very high for them because they are trying to create a new world. And I mean, we often forget when we're, or it's easy to forget how many people are actually engaged in it. I mean, everybody who's flying to Glasgow right now, people who are, fighting in Fairy Creek. I mean, these people, these passionate young people, I've gone up twice to write about Fairy Creek. It's been an extraordinary thing to face that passion. It makes me want to cry just thinking about it. I mean, these young people taking their hands, putting them in cement pipe, drilling it into the ground, standing in front of bulldozers or going up on tripods. And, they are putting their bodies in the way of great danger to save those 1,000-year-old trees. And they all talk about it as an act of climate, vigilantism. They're all there because they know that these trees sequester carbon. I mean, they're all over the science on how important this temperate forest is for protecting the environment, creating, protecting the rivers of rain, the air rivers, the atmospheric rivers that water Winnipeg, or water the prairies. I mean, it's all connected. So my people in my book are of that vein. They have, and I think that represents just a real aspect of being human, that we have one ear to the ground, the daily things we're doing, the love and care and confusion and passion and mess that we live or create. And a lot of times another ear to something larger, which is, that in a sense, my characters were being called, just like the people at Fairy Creek are being called. And I think that's a beautiful thing about being human, to put that into fiction.
I agree, and I think that when we do fiction best, we really unpack what it means to be human in so many different ways. I think that's back to, I think David, you alluded to this, the power of fiction versus the power of any other genre, any other sort of type of writing, is that it really helps us to unpack all of what it means to be human. I had a friend who was a minister in Calgary, a United Church minister. He used to say there's more wisdom in a pint of Guinness than there is in most self-help books. But he said failing that, turn to literature for the answers. And absolutely. So yeah, Catherine, I want to close off this question with you, talking about consequences. Alan Milan at the time is the victim of the consequence of his own tendency to speak off the cuff, even if it's an unfair consequence, which sort of drives the whole narrative of the book, leading up to this choice he's making, which the consequences could be absolutely enormous. It could be catastrophic or it could be world saving. Talk to me about sort of how your characters sort of play into that.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, for this great question, and it's been fascinating. I've just been so absorbed in both David and Shayna's answers, and also the way they're speaking to the power of what fiction can do, and certainly one of the things that interests me as a novelist is that a novel can bring complex and contradictory emotions to life and also put complex ethical issues into play. And so, yeah, my character, Milan Wells, who then takes the name of Alan, in the early part of the novel, he's trying to let the world know about the dangers of global warming, only to be set upon by climate deniers, as actually happened to climate scientists in 2009. And so I base that very much on reality. And as is his subsequent interest, again, from this deep emotional place that he wants to protect his daughter. I mean, that's his motivation, inspired by Prospero, the magician in The Tempest, as David has alluded to. But I really was interested in how, that mixture of climate grief, but also parental protectiveness might lead someone to consider something like solar geoengineering, solar radiation management, which, for those that don't know, involves shooting tiny particulate matter into the atmosphere, which doesn't actually resolve the problem of greenhouse gases and the rise of carbon or methane in the atmosphere, but creates a kind of blanket that repels solar radiation and stops the globe's temperature from warming as quickly. So it's a Band-Aid. And what's been fascinating to me in terms of researching the project is to speak to people who aren't necessarily just tech geeks, but are interested in this kind of technology out of a sense of desperation, because not enough is being done, and they are responding out of fear. And so we need to do this research because not having the possible tool in the toolbox, knowing if it might work or might not, it's worse not to know. And so those ethical and emotional complexities are fascinating to me. And it's interesting, when I started work on the novel, I was told by someone in the kind of climate culture community not to write about geoengineering because it was too morally dangerous. And I said, but a novel is exactly the place to explore that terrain. And Milan actually, Alan eventually, doesn't pursue it. I mean, all the way, and even doing real field experiments is still incredibly contentious in the real world. But again, a novel, it seems to me, is a place to explore those kind of ethical issues and a zone in which to think through both the feeling around them and the moral complexities. And it's difficult, just the whole idea of consequences. I mean, it's very hard for us to admit right now. The stakes are so high for all of us, and that's a hard thing to live with on a daily basis. So yeah, I'll stop there because I know you've got another question. There's so much more I could say.
Well, I do, but I don't know if we're going to have time to get to it because questions have started to roll in on the Q&A panel, and I want to give us a chance to address some of those. We've got about 15 minutes left in our panel, and I'm going to pivot to some of those questions. And folks, if you're out there in the audience and you have a question, throw it into the live event Q&A chat box on the upper right-hand side of your screen, and we'll address those as they come in. So I'm going to switch it up a little, turn to some of those questions if that's okay, and we're going to address one of those. The first one is from Carrie, who says, I think about how it's assumed that information will lead to action in society, but it doesn't often seem to happen. How do you folks deal with that as writers? And I think, David, I'm going to ask you this first because you're nodding vigorously. I can see you.
Yeah, I'm nodding vigorously because I'm so compelled by this this question, which I have not put adequate thought into. Yeah, the relationship between information and action. I don't know. I'm certainly, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about fiction. I'm thinking about how difficult action is, and I'm thinking about one of the things that, this is not necessarily related to that question, but one of the things that I was thinking about when Catherine was speaking just now is about responsibility and the way that that gets diffused, and the fact that we all know what's at stake here. It's not quite, we're not quite able to identify wrongdoer for, right? Yeah, I don't know, information, action. I certainly don't think fiction is the place. For me, it's about the question. What's interesting about the question is about the role of fiction for action, I guess, and whether sort of telling those beautiful stories that we have to tell when we're engaging, this is something I think a lot about, but when we're engaging with ecological worlds and trying to make them beautiful, as Shayna was sort of describing, you know, does that change people? Does that make people go out and act? Is that really going to help the situation? I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an equally legitimate answer to the question is, does a compelling story compel you to action as much as information does? Shayna, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just dying to jump in here. So is Catherine. This is such a great question. And I mean, my tendency is to feel that there is no place, like fiction, you know, how information leads to action is a political question, and fiction plays a different role. And I am so interested in the role that fiction doesn't play in leading to action. I think that every now and then you hear of somebody, for instance, Seth Klein, who's a dear friend and has written a brilliant book, The Good War, is all about how to get people acting as though we're facing a war, which we are, and to mobilize as we did in World War II. And at one point I was on a panel with him and he said, fiction writers can play a role in that. And he said, we can mobilize the fiction writers. Enough of this dystopian fiction. We'll get them to write some good, solid utopian fiction and get it out there. And they will start, you know, we'll give a few grants and they'll start to be able to play a role. And I just thought, you know, I can't disagree with that more, that fiction is so messy, so sloppy, so confusing, and so feelingful that it can't be harnessed in that particular way. And when societies have tried to harness fiction to an end, you end up with the 1930s, those abysmal plays that were being written around the time that, you know, Stanislavski was creating such brilliant theater. And then they'd go to the playwrights and they'd say that the plays are horrible because they were all, well, first of all, they were scared for their lives. But second of all, they were all trying to write to rote for a new Soviet reality, and it didn't work. So I think that the role of fiction is to make people feel and touch and experience, and you can actually cause people to, you know, cry like they've never cried before over a book, and feel, as I just, you know, have felt, for instance, reading Catherine's work. You feel the wind, you feel the clouds, you feel the desire to save the world, you feel the connection of the characters, you feel a new place. I've never been that far east, but you feel it. And so then that subtly changes you. But those changes they can't lead to action as a map, but they can lead to action if they're done authentically enough. But it's like that long, complex journey that we go through to be writers. And I feel as though, just to finish this point, one aspect of it is to deny the workability of our work. Like it can't be put to simple use.
That's fantastic. Catherine.
Yeah. I mean, you spoke so beautifully, Shayna and David, before, you know, to the complexity of fiction. But I do want to come back to something that Shayna herself said earlier, which was just about care. I mean, you can't even want to transform something that you don't notice or pay attention to and then care about. And so that seems to me that an ethics that, you know, climate fiction can engage in terms of allowing people to really notice the world, and by paying attention with a kind of tenderness that isn't sentimental, but is just focused and yeah, has care at its root, but doesn't deny complexity or contradictions of emotion, which I just feel is at the heart of the fiction that interests me. And I do lose patience with some dystopian projects because I can feel myself as a reader pulling back from that. But I did also just want to mention Kim Stanley Robinson's recent novel, The Ministry for the Future, which I read without a great deal of expectation and found it to be a really fascinating utopian project, but not one that was necessarily telling us what to do or how to behave, but opening up big zones of possibility and but still being complex. But its impulse was utopian. And yet it was still messy. The world it was describing was very messy and full of hypocrisy and contradiction. And I do think that one of the things that fiction can do is bring care and attention to all this complexity of the human world and the way we live in relation to all it is more than human.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. All three great responses to a really thoughtful question. Fiction is messy, and I think it's good to acknowledge that. Messy and inspiring all at the same time. We have, I think it's probably going to be our last question we're going to go to before we wrap up, from an anonymous questioner who asks if climate fiction needs to be scientifically accurate, and I'm going to expand that in the context of this panel to also say historically accurate. How much accuracy or grounded in science or history does climate fiction need to be in order to sort of do all those things that we're saying we wanted to do? And then Catherine, let me throw it back to you for the last word.
Okay, sure. Thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks, Jason. No, that's great. I think it entirely depends on the kind of project that you're creating. I mean, there's certainly climate responsive novels like, Jenny Offel's Weather, which aren't engaged with climate science. They're engaged with how we live at this time, how we deal with dread, how we navigate our families in this, larger weather of the moment. In terms of Blaise Island, because the central character is a climate scientist, I did feel a responsibility to be scientifically accurate, both in terms of his career and in terms of the climate engineering that he engages in, even though it becomes slightly fantastic. But I did want it grounded in actual science. But I'm interested in intersections of science and magical thinking. And it seems to me that, within our larger world, I mean, capitalism looks rooted in certain kinds of rationalism, and then it becomes a wild kind of magical thinking at a certain point and stops making any sense, in terms of growth and more growth. And so again, in terms of thinking about this, the science of climate engineering, the desire to believe and the place that desire holds in our belief systems, I think is really important to acknowledge, not just reason, but desire. And that's very important to me as a fiction writer to engage with all sorts of desires. I mean, there's these businessmen, this crazy, billionaire airline magnate in my novel who wants to believe, that we can go on as we've been going. And that's looks rational to some people, but to others looks, impossible. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. What a lovely response. Shayna, your book has been described as a really important historical look at a biography of a character, although it is also fictional. What was the role that accuracy played in your book?
Oh, it was it really was like a weight around my neck at certain points.
Sure.
You're so concerned and you feel so ethically responsible towards these people who, I would have envy for people who are writing about characters who were 100, 200 years dead, as for instance, my friend Eva Stachniak does, writing about, Russia at the time of Catherine the Great. And I think, nobody's going to sue her. Nobody's still alive. so I felt a responsibility for sure. I think my sense for this question is to know as much as you possibly can and then start playing, because you also don't want to feel so rigid within this, so rigid within your research or bound. And I was really loving what Catherine said about desire. Like, I think that's true. Like, if you can be led by desire, you're going to be led into some really interesting places. And I always find it interesting where, like, if I'm writing a short story that's based on something that I knew about, or, that I had a real kind of edifice originally, at what point do you need to start fictionalizing it? At what point does the story begin to make those subtle, really important demands? And I love that, because then that's the juice, right? Because it's causing you to cross over. So I would say to anybody who's, if you ever feel bound by the realities, think about just unhinging them a little bit and getting outside them, because that could free you up in some interesting ways. And I will say one other thing that connected to what Catherine was saying, that the world is so strange right now, and the fiction is changing in response to that. And again, Amitav Ghosh and other people, Margaret Atwood, have directly addressed that in the rise of speculative fiction as a very important art form in the period that we're going through. And I think that's because there's a lot you can get at when you let your imagination free like that. So I would say that that the strictures of fiction that have existed, the sort of Edith Wharton, the definition of fiction as incremental alterations of character over time, we might have to throw those out the window. We may be into something new because we've never lived this and we've never written it before.
So true. Thank you. David, in some of your short stories, accuracy is paramount in terms of the chemical cracking process for petroleum and for the effect that hot bitumen can have on the human body. But in other ways, it's very magical, and it very detaches itself from what we may think of reality. Talk to me about that. We're going to close off with you there.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have a lot of trouble following what Shayna just said, because that was really, really, really moving to me as well. And I think you're right about form. I think form has always been reinventing itself in relation to the social and political situation, right? And we're definitely, because we're at a crazy moment for that. I wonder if fiction has always been speculative, though, as well, much as Edith Wharton might have been trying to go for something else. In my own fiction, I think it's just about building trust. So I do a lot of research. I did a lot of research about petroleum. It's really hard to do research about petroleum. The companies weren't always so down with me trying to do research about petroleum. And that was actually, I learned a lot through resistance in that way, which is interesting. But yeah, I have a whole stack of really boring books like Petrochemical Engineering in Non-Technical Language. Which, like, the language is pretty technical. But yeah, I think trying to establish trust with the reader through trying to get to that authenticity that Shayna was describing through work, right, is through the work of creating a realistic setting is an important responsibility of any writer. I mean, yeah, this stuff should all be fact checked. With climate questions and climate science, there's some interesting, as Catherine's saying, ethical conundrums and sort of difficult gray areas. And I think those are right terrain for fiction to explore. So yeah, that's how I feel about truth, trust, authenticity in my work in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful answers. And thank you for the listeners for your lovely questions. Some really, really thoughtful insight. We started talking about the role of climate in fiction and ended up talking about the role of fiction in everything. And for that, I'm really grateful. It's a great discussion. We have a minute left, so I'm going to wrap it up and say David Huebert is the author of Chemical Valley. Shayna Lambert is the author of Petra. and Catherine Bush is the author of Blaise Island. You can grab all three of these books through HPL or at, like Nancy said at the beginning, through your local indie bookseller, Epic or the City of the City or King West Books or anybody in Hamilton that supports good literature. You'll find those there. I'm Jason Allen. I'm the host of the Environmental Urbanist on 93.3 CFMU. Hope I can catch you on an upcoming Tuesday afternoon at 1. Until then, thank you so much to my guests, my authors. Thank you to Nancy and Kate for coordinating the whole thing. Thank you to the HPL for hosting us. And thanks to you, folks who are out in the audience, for joining us today. And hope you took away something from this. Thanks again, and have a great night. Take care.